So Russian mill bloggers are today saying that Pokrovsk has fallen. Quote, "It's over. The battle ended with our victory." So today we're going to take a look at a few battlefield updates, not just at Pokrovsk, but also Siversk and Kupiansk, where Russian forces have advanced in recent days. Starting out just 4 days ago, Russian President Vladimir Putin said that 70% of Pokrovsk has been liberated. We now have Russian sources today upping that number to 100%. I'm not entirely sure that I would say that quite yet. Look, the fog of war here is incredibly thick, and it's not just like literal fog over the battlefield in Pokrovsk. We got some pictures showing that in recent days, but the footage has been very spotty from both sides. And from what I can tell, there's nothing today that is so significantly different from 1, 2, 3 days ago. So yes, some Russians are saying this is the moment. Pokrovsk has now officially fallen. My gut says that we're probably going to see continued fighting in Pokrovsk, like in the actual city itself, for quite a while still. But either way, looking at the Russian assessment as of today, Russian mill blogger Swadky said, quote, "And now, after several months of exhausting battles, it's over. The battle ended with our victory." Two majors said, quote, "Pokrovsk is encircled. The ring has closed. Ukrainian logistics are now not just disrupted by drones, but physically controlled on the ground. The fall of the Pokrovsk-Minograd area is now just a matter of time." In fact, I want to go ahead and pull up a map to give you an idea of the areas we're going to be talking about today. This is one of those where there's a very stark difference between what we have here with Deep State map versus Syriac map. And we're going to bounce back and forth between these two. But if you look at Syriac, you can see, I think I zoomed into the wrong area there. I got to come back out. On Syriac, you can see that the entirety of Pokrovsk is listed as not the gray zone, but being under direct Russian control. Quite a bit different with Deep State map. So we are going to be bouncing back and forth between a few. But this area here is what Two Majors is saying has been completely closed off. And any Ukrainian forces in here now have to battle not just through Russian drones, but through Russian ground forces to the north and northwest if they wanted to escape. Russian mill blogger Alexander Koth said, quote, "The Ministry of Defense is publishing a video from the Shakersky neighborhood," and we'll play that here, showing, this is in Pokrovsk, showing troops from the center group calmly moving around the territory under their control. Judging by the absence of Ukrainian drones in the air, enemy birdhouses have been significantly pushed back. Yes and no. There's a couple of ways to read into that. No doubt, Ukrainian drone positions have been moved further and further back as Russian forces have advanced. There's also been a staggering amount of fog in recent days, which aligns with recent Russian advances. We just did an interview with a Ukrainian drone pilot yesterday that's set to come out here maybe today or tomorrow, where we talked about the challenges of drone operations in these weather conditions. In the rain, drones just generally can't fly. But in the fog, recon drones have to go very, very low. FPV drones have to go very, very low. So it's harder to identify targets, harder to effectively strike targets. So the drone saturation over the battlefield is significantly degraded in times of fog. So fog means that the infantry advances. So I don't know with clear skies if Russian forces would necessarily be moving around like this openly through the center of Pokrovsk right now. That is still very much in range of a lot of Ukrainian drones, but it probably points to the significant fog cover engulfing much of the battlefield right now. Turning over to military informant, and I'll shift over to Syriac map here. He says, in fact, 100% of the Pokrovsk territory is either under the control of the Russian armed forces or in a gray zone. Because of this, the northern and southern claws of the Russian army have practically closed in on each other. And this is the area he's talking about here, south of Rodinsky, kind of northeast of Pokrovsk, suggesting this has been closed off. And I mean, let's be honest, even if this isn't closed off, if these two areas are controlled by Russian forces, it's effectively closed off because this entire area, pretty small, would be under direct fire control of Russian forces. He says the enemy is still left with a small corridor of the gray zone, allowing passage into the city, but the chances of an organized exit from Minograd have practically disappeared. The coming weeks will decide the fate of both the city and those who have decided to remain in the virtually encircled cauldron. So again, even some mixed reports coming from military informant in that same post, right? He says that 100% of Pokrovsk is under Russian control or in the gray zone, and then goes on to say, and the coming weeks will be decisive to see what actually happens here. Now, I think the timing, the reason that we've seen a lot of Russian channels recently across the internet jump on the statement right now that Pokrovsk has been captured has more to do with the timelines with the ceasefire negotiations than with any direct operational changes on the ground. Again, if you look at the footage coming out, the map locations, nothing has substantially changed. I mean, no doubt Pokrovsk has been a tough situation for Ukraine for a long time. We have seen rather steady Russian advances in this area, but the only thing that really changed in the last, say, 72, 96 hours was the U.S., EU, Ukraine, and Russia peace negotiations. So clearly Russia wants something to be able to say, while this is ongoing, no need to negotiate, guys. We've got the upper hand. Look at our battlefield successes. And when a city like Pokrovsk is entirely in the gray zone, I think there is enough footage out there right now to where you can take either stance. If you want to say that Pokrovsk is entirely under Russian control and the fight for this city is over, I think there's enough Russian footage to say that. If you want to say there's still Ukrainian elements in the city fighting, killing, and pushing back Russian forces in certain areas, there is also enough footage to justify that. Now, turning to the Ukrainian update around Pokrovsk, the 25th Airborne put out an assessment here saying, quote, "The defense forces are holding back the enemy and conducting search and strike operations to eliminate the Russians in Pokrovsk. They say our positions remain in the city center. Shooting battles continue, and the enemy fails to establish a foothold. Assault groups continue to be involved in eliminating the enemy in the city center in coordination with other units within the responsibility zone of the 7th Corps of the Air Assault Forces. In particular, the 425th Separate Assault Regiment Scala cleared enemy presence in the area of the railway station." We've got some of that footage from the 425th we'll play here. They say this allowed blocking the Russian attempts to accumulate forces who unsuccessfully try to increase pressure on the northern part of the city. The enemy suffers maximum losses when trying to cross into the northern part of the city via the railway. And then Deep State Map, so the actual map we're looking at here on the screen, I think has done a pretty good job with some of their assessments recently. Generally speaking, and this applies across the board. So today we're looking at a lot of Russian sources talking about Russian advances. Ukrainian sources talking about Russian advances tend to be a little delayed, and vice versa. So when we look at the map here and we move up to the Dobropilia pocket where Ukraine was clearing out Russian forces over the course of the last couple months, Russia just stopped talking about this entirely. So to get any information out of this, to include verified footage of Russian soldiers being killed or captured, that was all coming from the Ukrainian side. So just something to keep in mind. We are going to be pretty heavily focused on Russian sources today, but Deep State Map put out an assessment on the 21st, so 3 days ago now, but talking about the situation in this Pokrovsk pocket. And this was their most recent analysis from what I've seen. They said from the south, the enemy is moving into the central part of the city, which is gradually coming under enemy control, where the Russians are setting up positions, consolidating, and entering the stage of a full-scale battle for the settlement. Active hunting is being carried out in the railway area to prevent the enemy from taking control there as well. But a large number of sightings already in the northern part of the city indicate signs that the red zone will soon reach the railroad tracks, especially in the southwestern part of Pokrovsk. I'm going to shift this over to a satellite view to get a little better idea of what they're talking about here in the city. So Deep State Map, again, shows some Russian elements north of this railway that bisects Pokrovsk right here from west to east. If we go over to Suryak, you'll see that they have that entire area completely now under Russian control. The 25th says there's an increase in infantry group sightings in the area in the settlement of Rivne, so a little bit here to the east, which was part of an important logistics chain to Minegrad. The enemy is setting ambushes, establishing various engineering obstacles, and making normal movement impossible, which has long since turned into a lottery. The greater the enemy's absorption of Pokrovsk, the more it critically threatens the retention of Minegrad and further maneuvers if they become necessary. The defense group forces in Minegrad continue to hold their defense, feeling constant pressure from the east, south, and north. Over here on the map, frequent sightings are noted on the southern outskirts of the city, but the enemy has no clear footholds there yet. The battle for Pokrovsk and Minegrad continues. Now, a key note there when looking at the way that Deep State is talking about this, they talked about the enemy's absorption in Pokrovsk. And it's something that we need to consider as the Russian tactics are changing here. So what you are seeing in Pokrovsk right now and have for a long time is not a platoon, company, battalion-sized assault moving forward, taking over a city block, and then staging out of there for future pushes. into the city, but instead small groups, 1, 2, 3, 4 Russian soldiers at a time. They move into basements or hardened structures and hold up and wait for others to come forward. And then they kind of, again, it's the absorption in the city is the best way to put this. You've got a lot of small groups of Russian soldiers throughout Pokrovsk, which leads to this question of how much of this is actually under Russian control. We'll zoom in here on the map real quick. If we look at this entire area on the map, let's say there's 40 Russian soldiers spread across 20 different buildings here. Would you say that's under Russian control? If the Ukrainian element is able to get right in the middle and take some of them out, I mean, gray area has kind of been the situation in Pokrovsk for a long time. That said, as this absorption continues, there's a number here where maybe 30 Russian soldiers does not control this entire area on the screen, but 300 probably would. Right, so what we're seeing is this slow trickle of Russian soldiers moving into Pokrovsk as best they can. And what's helping them right now, we've got a couple different interesting pictures showing Russian soldiers moving in to the Pokrovsk area over the course of the last really 3 to 4 days. And what you're seeing here is just heavy fog cover. Again, that allows, so you see them using a lot of vehicles, not armored vehicles, but motorcycles, homemade buggies, ATVs, things like that, to push more and more soldiers into Pokrovsk to increase that absorption and kind of mass forces as forward as possible, especially while this fog continues to cover the battlefield. Now we're going to shift over to a couple other areas, Kupiansk and Siversk, where there's been some updates in terms of Russian activity. But first things first, an update on the fundraiser. We're picking up some drone interceptors for the 429th Unmanned Systems Regiment Achilles. Right now, we're sitting just shy of $40,000. It's getting ready to refresh right now. I was hoping one was going to hit. So we're just shy of $40,000. A couple rewards we just stood up. $200 plus gets you a patch from the Achilles unit. $1,000 plus gets you a signed flag from the Achilles team. So hopefully wrap this thing up here before too awful long. These guys are buying interceptor drones to shoot down Russian reconnaissance drones like Supercams, as well as Orlan drones. They're shooting down Lancets, so loiter munitions, Shahid-style long-range munitions that Russia is firing pretty regularly into Ukrainian cities. So trying to help out the Achilles guys right here. Did an interview a couple weeks ago with a couple of their pilots. Crazy stuff these interceptor units are doing. But for those interested and able, the link to contribute is in the description below. Be sure to add Achilles to the donation note so we can track our progress. Now, moving on here, we'll get back to the map, and I'm going to shift over to Kupiansk, where there's actually been pretty significant updates in the past couple days. 2 areas here. We'll kind of slowly move over so you can see the 2 locations. First, Siversk, to the northeast, a bit of Pokrovsk, and then further north of there into Kupiansk. We're actually going to start now in Kupiansk, an area that's seen a pretty heavy focus of Russian attacks now for a couple months, and we'll get it on both maps again. As mentioned before, there's pretty stark differences between what we're seeing on Deep State and what we're seeing on Syriac. So starting with Syriac here, this kind of aligns with what the Russian Ministry of Defense is saying, where just a couple days ago, 2 days to be specific, the MOD announced the complete liberation of Kupiansk, showing footage of their soldiers operating in a few different areas of the city. So we'll show that footage here. Military informant, a Russian military reporter, said, quote, "This is another case of putting the cart before the horse. Where are the 18 Ukrainian battalions previously encircled in Kupiansk? Wherever they've gone is unknown. We will assume they were destroyed, surrendered, or moved backwards towards neighboring territories." And this has been kind of a theme in a lot of these pockets and advances as Russia moves into areas like Kupiansk, Pokrovsk. We saw it in Avdiivka, north in Sudza. Do you remember when the Russian offensive was, or kind of counteroffensive, counterattack was pushing Ukraine out of Kursk? And in the United States even, we had prominent voices saying this has to stop. There are 10,000 or more Ukrainian soldiers surrounded. They have to strike a peace deal now. And that tends to be a Russian theme. It's a propaganda piece to say that many Ukrainians are about to be killed or captured. It hasn't really materialized anywhere. I mean, the closest we could get to is back at the Azovstal steel plant at the beginning of the war, where there no doubt were a number of people captured. But even the numbers coming out at the time were like in the thousands. And I want to say it was 1, 2, maybe 300 total that ended up being captured there. So either way, military informant kind of on top of things saying, what about the 18 Ukrainian battalions? Alexander Kotz looked at this and said, great, we took Kupiansk. What's next? Already ready for the next advance of the Russian military, which might be a little premature based off of how we've seen progress materialize in the battlefield. Kot said, quote, Kupiansk has come under the control of the Russian army. The enemy garrison has been destroyed. Fighting for the city of 25,000 went on for many months. During fierce battles, Russian troops entered Kupiansk from the east. We'll zoom in here. You see the city center. He said they crossed the Oskil River here to the east and established a bridgehead. After consolidating and bringing up forces, they advanced further. In June, they took Moskva, a northwest suburb, and in September, for the third time in this conflict, they carried out a pipe operation, which largely determined the fate of the Kupiansk garrison. I'm not sure I would put that much stock in the pipe operation. He talks about this briefly, where he says they infiltrated through the city through a main gas pipeline. Obviously, this tactic proved effective again. The enemy was caught off guard, attacked from the rear, bypassing main defensive nodes. Essentially, the Russian army invented a new type of combat, pipeline warfare, in which assault groups are transported underground to their destination. The possibilities of this tactic in Ukraine are very broad since the territory is crisscrossed by a network of major gas pipelines. Talk about a job I don't want, is walking through a pipeline trying to pop out on the other side of enemy lines and carry out that attack. The reason I say I don't think the pipeline operation here is hugely successful, and in retrospect, it did prove very effective in Avdiivka and did prove very effective in Kursk. They were key components to each one of those battles. The Russians moving through the pipes. Here, they were not, from all the information we have, they were not using those pipes to bypass Ukrainian positions, and they were not moving into the city center. They were using those pipes further north here to just get somewhere near the battlefield. So the approaches, like we saw down in Pokrovsk, were so heavily overwatched by Ukrainian drones that they simply used those to move within striking distance of the city. Now, again, based off of, this is one of those where I have a feeling that Russia is applying more value to those pipe operations after the fact than during. There just wasn't a lot of coverage of this, and the coverage that did come out showed just, individual 1, 2, 3 Russian soldiers at a time, kind of using it sparingly to move into some of the areas in the outskirts of northern Kupiansk. Maybe more information will come out later, but as of now, I'm not so sure the pipeline operation necessarily had a lot to do with the taking of Kupiansk. Kot said next came the systematic clearing of urban districts. Now the entire western bank of the Oskil River from Kupiansk to the Russian border is under the Russian army control. This will accelerate the liberation of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, key for the defense of the Ukrainian armed forces in the Donbass. So the areas he's talking about here, suggesting that with the taking of Kupiansk, they will be able to we've got to zoom out quite a bit here. It says the taking of Kupiansk, might be better on this map. Some of these maps are lagging a little bit. So the taking of Kupiansk all the way up here, he says, will facilitate the taking of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk all the way down here in Donetsk. Again, maybe big picture, right? I don't know that that's how the battlefield has really played out in this war so far. In all likelihood, the taking of Kupiansk will force the eventual collapsing of this pocket, and you'll see Ukrainian forces move back likely to the western border of the Oskil River and try to dig in and hold here. I'm not sure it directly translates to the closing out and encirclement of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk this much further north. Now we do have a bit of a Ukrainian update here, not a lot when it comes to Siversk and Kupiansk, but with Kupiansk, the Ukrainian update I was able to find came from Mirshenkov, who said, quote, fighting continues in the central, southwestern, and northwestern parts of the city. 24 positions have changed hands 5 to 6 times already, and it continues. The occupiers also continue to distract our reserves west of the city. Overall, the situation in Kupiansk has not been as rosy for the enemy for 2 weeks as it was before. Our warriors are clearing out the scum in the city meter by meter. Now, it was a couple weeks ago, Ukrainian President Zelensky kind of suggested that Russian forces were encircled and about to get wiped out in Kupiansk. We haven't really seen that materialize, but it's also worth keeping in mind what is happening right now in Kupiansk, and as we shift down to Siversk, is very similar in terms of the tactics. So it is not a Russian battalion headquarters that needs to be pushed back. It is individual Russian soldiers that are being hunted down throughout this area. So claiming Russian control is tenuous. And then sometimes those 1, 2, 3 Russian soldiers get killed, and technically it could lead to a drastic change on the map if this was 100% precise. But again, Ukrainian sources saying they are continuing to fight in and around Kupiansk. Now we're going to shift down a little further south to an area that we generally have not seen a lot of activity on for quite a while, Siversk. So we'll zoom in here on, this is going to be a good one to look at on Deep State Map, actually, because it's going to show how quickly, how rapidly some of the situation changed here in recent days. To do this timeline, we're going to shift back to the standard map. Just moves a little faster when we do it this way. But here we have Siversk, kind of in a bit of a pocket already in eastern Ukraine. And I'm going to go back just a week. You'll see how this has changed, where there's not a lot of progress up to the 15th. And then over the span of the last couple days, we saw a pretty significant Russian push into the city. In fact, Russian sources right now are suggesting that they have taken Siversk entirely. Alexander Kot said, quote, "The Siversk direction has finally started moving. The media report that the Russian army managed to break through a well-fortified defensive line and enter Siversk from the south. The Ukrainian military in turn confirmed that the Russians are infiltrating the city in small groups and trying to establish themselves. Again, the infiltration tactics that we have seen Russia carry out for quite a while, because the Ukrainian lines here and elsewhere along the front are likely thinly manned with infantry and heavily reliant on drones. That opens the possibility and the likelihood for small groups to infiltrate through and establish themselves in places, in this case, in Siversk." Kot said, quote, "In addition, footage from our drone operators has started appearing on social media from this direction. That means the UAV crews have already approached the city and are actively working, pushing the enemy out of the low airspace." And two majors commented on this as well, saying, quote, "Russian troops continue to cut off the pockets around Siversk. In fact, in less than 2 weeks, the Russian armed forces have made significant advances and occupied a fairly extensive area near Siversk. Now, the situation of the remaining Ukrainian units in Siversk is close to critical. All roads leading to the city are either cut off or under fire control by Russian UAV operators." Now, given the progress here recently, certainly some push into Siversk, but based off of the Russian progress to the north and northwest, I would have been surprised if these areas weren't already under pretty significant Russian drone control prior to just a couple days ago. Two Majors continues by saying, "Judging by the pace of the Russian armed forces' advances, the moment for a counterattack and stabilization of the situation for the Ukrainian armed forces has already been missed. Now the only question is how quickly the assault troops will clear the buildings in the city center." So, look, no doubt across the board we are seeing pretty notable Russian advances from Pokrovsk, Siversk, and further north in Kupiansk. Like, if you're looking at this writ large, all of the stories right now are Russian forces advancing, Ukrainian forces falling back and trying to hold the line. That's generally been the story for much of the last year, with a few minor exceptions. What I would watch for here in the coming days are, it's going to end up being labeled a Ukrainian counterattack. That might be a bit of a stretch, but we're going to see some pushes from some of these more mobile assault units, things like Azov and the 93rd and the 425th that's operating down in Pokrovsk. I would expect some of them to move into areas like Siversk, Kupiansk, and probably a continued presence in Pokrovsk to try to hunt down and at least slow the Russian absorption into some of these cities. But look, it's nothing new, and it should be no surprise to anybody who's been following this war. What we're seeing play out right now is the challenge that Ukraine has with holding a very, very wide front with limited infantry. They have a lot of drones. They've made a lot of successful progress on the drone front and a lot of incredible innovations, and are inflicting massive casualties on the Russian forces as they advance. But at the end of the day, soldiers take and hold territory, and generally everywhere you're seeing progress in the front right now, Russia has the advantage in terms of manpower, and they are continuing to push those men forward into some of these gaps that are deliberately there by Ukraine because they're being manned by drone units, and they're taking advantage of that slowly but surely. Now, we very well might be seeing the last kind of desperate pushes by the Russian military before the weather turns and they're not able to really carry out any serious advances at all. But yeah, the trend right now, not positive for Ukraine, to be blunt. But that's all we got for now. We'll do our best to keep an eye on it going forward. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.